I wanted to officially thank you to our first webinar. There's going to be many more to come. In fact, we have one on Thursday, which is about watersheds, where we'll be talking about watershed health, pollution of water, and what you can be doing at home to prevent some of that pollution. If you have any questions at any point, you can go ahead and put those in the chat box, and you could also raise your hand and I can call on you then and we can answer some of your questions. I do want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and we'll have it available on Facebook. So to get started, my name is Ashley Palmer and I'm the Conservation Education Specialist at the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District, which is quite a mouthful. And at the Soil and Water Conservation District, I do a lot of our outreach and education. So if we've come to your school or you've seen us at a tabling event, you've probably seen me there. I also manage a lot of our social media, our stream monitoring program, and our storm drain labeling campaign. I received both my bachelor's and master's of science in environmental science from George Mason University, and I actually just got my master's in December, so I'm still pretty excited about that. And I've been beekeeping for about 5 years. I studied at George Mason University. They have a really great program there, which is led by Herman Perea, who actually does a lot of beekeeping in Colombia as well. So he is a wealth of knowledge. I joined the Loudoun Beekeepers Association, which is the local beekeeping group here in Loudoun, and I've learned so much from them. And I also learned a lot about beekeeping from trial and error. This isn't my job, but it is my passion. And take everything that I say in this presentation with a little grain of salt, because I found that if you ask one question to 10 beekeepers, you'll often get 11 different answers. Almost all of the images are going to be of my own hives, and if they're not, I'll point those out. So generally, if you have questions about any of the images, I should be able to answer those. And then, because kids always ask me, what pets do I have? I have a cat, I have a turtle, I have a hermit crab, and currently I have about 100,000 honeybees. But that could change. So throughout this presentation, feel free to ask questions anytime you like, and I'll check often to see if there's any questions and if I can address those. I'll try to present for about 30 or 45 minutes total to leave time for more questions at the end if they're popping up as you're thinking. And we're going to be covering different types of bees. What's the difference between a worker and a drone and a queen? We'll talk about a bee life cycle. What's it like to be a baby bee, and as you get older, what changes? We'll talk about the jobs in the hive, which are very interesting. So you'll see that your job actually changes as you get older as a bee. So we'll see what those different jobs might be. We'll talk about honeybee pollination, why it's valuable to agriculture, where to find honeybees, and some local honeybees that you might not have known were hanging around. If you haven't seen a beehive before, you haven't seen the inside of a hive, the background of this slide is a really good example of what they usually look like. This is called a Langstroth hive. It comes with large rectangular frames that go in a wooden box. You've probably seen those if you've ever seen those little drawings of a beehive or ones on a farm. That's likely what you've seen. It's full of tons of little cells, and bees use these cells to raise their young and store their resources. So they'll have baby bees on here, and in one frame they'll have the baby bees, the larvae, they'll have nectar, they'll have pollen. All of their resources are going to be stored in one place. So welcome to the colony, or at least who lives there. So we'll talk about all of these guys individually, but I definitely want you to notice a couple of big things that are different between them. Firstly, the sizes. We've got a worker on the left, a queen on the right, and in the center, a drone. And they all have distinctly different sizes. So when you see some pictures later, you probably will be able to tell them apart. Some things in particular that are interesting is that if you look at the drone, his eyes are huge. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is. But when I tell you the drone is male, that might help you to guess. The queen here has a very, very large abdomen, which is very important for her because she's going to be using that to lay eggs all throughout her life. What's particularly interesting when you start talking about honeybees is that the individual does not matter very much unless it's the queen. Usually we talk about something called a superorganism. And in this case, the superorganism is the entire hive. It's all the little pieces that are coming together to make one big organism. It's kind of like if you get a scratch, you're still going to be fine. The bigger you is okay, whereas the part that got the scratch might be hurting a little bit. It's very similar with these bees. We talk about the superorganism because although it might seem harsh to us, they don't particularly care if something happens to one bee, again, unless that's the queen. And I'll talk a little bit about what her role is later. So based on that last picture, you might be able to tell which ones here in this picture are drones. So I'll give you just a little bit to look over those and to think about it. Drones have really big eyes and a big chunky body. They're very barrel-shaped. So I hope you found them. There they are. And then there's actually a fourth drone that's above the left red circle, above the other two drones. Drones are all male, so if you are in a beehive and you are male, you are a drone. In the summer, you could have thousands of drones, but otherwise there's going to be very few of them. They're relatively short-lived, but they're important because they help increase diversity in the hive. The whole reason that a hive would have drones is to have them mate with the queen during swarming season, which we'll see, or when a new queen is born. And when it's time to mate with the drones, the queen will make one mating flight in her entire life, just one, and on that one flight she'll mate with 20, 30 drones. So each one that she mates with gives different diversity to the hive, so that different young are going to be born with different traits. And the more diverse the hive is, the stronger it is, and the more resilient it is against disease. Unfortunately, because drones only serve for reproduction, once that time is done, they get kicked out of the hive. Again, this is one of those things about bees where it sounds really sad to us, but to them, it's normal. When their job is done, they get kicked out. It's a pretty hard knock life. So that's why you'll see a lot of them in the summer and in the spring, and then over winter, very, very, very few. These are worker bees. So all of the bees in this picture are worker bees. They're that small, slender bee that we saw earlier, and there's usually thousands or tens of thousands of these worker bees year-round. All worker bees are female. So all work in the hive is done by female bees. And when I say work, I mean work. They do a lot of work, and we'll actually talk a little bit about their jobs in particular later, but they do put in a lot of work. They're rather short-lived in the summer because they get worn out. So if you think about what a bee is doing in the spring and the summer, is that they're going out and they're collecting nectar and they're collecting pollen and they're pollinating, which is one of the reasons that we love them. But it's an awful lot of work. So when they are out in the spring and the summer, they tend not to live as long as the bees in the winter who are staying inside the hive and snuggling up with each other to stay warm. So over the summer, you'll see many, many thousands of worker bees, 30,000, 60,000, depending on how large it is. And then over winter, they get really close together and snuggle up to keep the queen warm, and you'll see much less of them, about 10 or 12 or 15,000. What's interesting about the worker bees as well is that they are all female, but they do not lay eggs, and they do not have new larvae in the hive. And the only time that they do lay eggs is if the queen is missing. So I'll talk more about what the queen does in a little bit, but anytime that you see workers laying, which they're really not supposed to do, it's a pretty bad sign. Last but certainly not least is the queen bee. So in this picture here on the left, she's almost all black. She's got a big bald spot behind her head. Her head is actually hidden behind some of those other bees, but you can see that long distended abdomen. That's the same one that we saw in the picture earlier. There is only one queen bee in each hive. There are some exceptions, but this is not that kind of presentation. Generally, there's just one queen bee for each hive. She is a female, and her job is to do all of the reproduction, lay all of the eggs, make all the new baby bees that grow to be workers and drones. It's a big job. But another important role is that she actually keeps the colony together. She emits a pheromone, a smell, that the other bees can smell. And when they smell it, they know it's her. They know it's their queen. And if you were to put any other kinds of pheromones in there, it would be very difficult for them. They wouldn't actually be able to stay in that environment. Either they would leave or they would get rid of the queen that's making that unknown pheromone. So that pheromone tells them to stay close to her, to protect her, and to protect the eggs that she's laid because they'll also smell like her and they'll have her pheromone. So by having her in place, even though she's just one of those 30,000 bees, it gives the whole hive the opportunity to stay together, to stay close, and to be next to each other, where they learn all of each other's smells. Each queen bee's pheromones are a little bit different, and it slightly changes the attitude of the hive. I currently have one hive right now where her pheromones were very weak, and they didn't like her very much, and the whole hive was really angry. When I went to inspect them, they were just really angry and buzzing really loud, and I had to use a lot of smoke, and they didn't like that either. And as time passed, they got used to the pheromone, they got used to her, and it became a stronger hive, but those first couple of weeks were really tough. This is a bee life cycle. So this is a really good drawing, and then in the next slide we'll see a little bit of the pictures of what these guys actually look like. It starts with the queen laying an egg, and she'll lay an egg in every cell. On that frame that you saw at the very beginning, she'll start in the center and work her way around in a spiral. So then the babies age out, and then they start replacing them from the center out again. They'll start by laying an egg. If you see an egg standing straight up like that, it means that it's 1 day old or less. And then they become a larva, and in those cells also you'll see a lot of the food that they feed them inside the cell with them once they're larvas. Once they get large enough, like on day 10 there, they'll start to cap it up and to close it. And that's to stop anything from getting inside or damaging the new bee as it's going through metamorphosis. So the worker is going to feed the larva, and then once it's large enough, she's going to cover the cell. While the cell is covered, which is day 10, day 15, day 18, the bee is growing. So it's becoming a pupa, and you'll start to see that it has some of the features of an adult bee that we would normally see. It's going to start to have legs, a head. It goes through a similar metamorphosis, actually, that a butterfly does. And then on day 21, it emerges as a worker bee. If it is a drone, it takes a little bit less time, and if it's a queen, it takes a little bit more time. And here are some pictures I have of the bee life cycle. So these are of my hive, and I was able to get a couple good pictures that are going to show us all the different stages. So the picture that's all the way on the left is actually a piece of comb that had to come out. It had to come off. It was placed in a precarious position and it had to go. And inside there you can see inside those cells at the very bottom these little itty bitty tiny eggs. Those guys are probably a day old, maybe a little bit less. And as you can imagine, if you've got a whole frame of really buzzy bees and you're trying to see if the babies are in there, then it could take quite some time to notice something that small. Whenever you see a characteristic picture of a beekeeper, you'll see them holding the frame up to the light, and that does make a really great picture, but a large part of that is that they're looking for the eggs in the light to try and see them. The picture that is on the right has larvae of a lot of different ages. There are some eggs in there. You'll see the larvae. Some of the ones towards the center of the picture are actually getting large enough that they're about to start capping those. So you can see how the queen would have started over onto the side, then moved over when she was laying. And here's a picture that has all the bees that we've already talked about. So all of the crumbly yellow pieces underneath the bees are actually the capped cells that have the pupa and the larva inside them as they're developing. So those are going to be new bees. And then you can also see on here the queen. You can see some drones, and you can see many workers. You can even see some of the workers' jobs. Some of them are taking care of the queen. Some of them are looking over the pupa and larva or the brood. The drones are kind of hanging out. They're not doing too much in this picture. So before I get into the next part, I wanted to ask if anyone has any questions. If so, you can put those in the chat box or you can raise your hand. And if you have one, I'll try and call on you and answer that. So if you're thinking of any, just let me know. We'll keep going. Here we get to talk about the roles of the worker bee. The worker bee has many, many, many roles, and they're all tied to the age of the worker bee. That kind of makes sense because as they get older, they're going to get stronger, their wings are going to get stronger, and then they're going to be able to do more hardy tasks like flying out. I did get a really good question. What do they feed the larvas? So they feed the larva a couple different things. They feed them the pollen, which is the protein source. And then they also feed them the nectar, which are the carbohydrates. It's what they get from the plants. And they also sometimes feed them something called royal jelly. And royal jelly is produced by the worker bees. They excrete it, and they use it to feed the ones that are going to become queens. So you don't often see them feeding it that. What's really interesting about the bees is that the only difference between a worker and a queen is that when they were larvae, one was fed royal jelly and the others weren't. It's a very fascinating process. When honeybees are first born and they're only a day or two old, then they start cleaning, and they actually start with their own cells. So in their cells, they have to clean up all the debris that was left behind from the food that they were fed, and they have to clean up and get all the extra wax out and things like that so that it's ready for the next egg that's going to be laid in there. When they're a little older, then they start feeding. They feed the oldest larva, and then they have the responsibility of feeding the younger larva. Really, the only difference here is that for the younger larva, you have to go a little bit deeper into the cell. So they just need to be a little bigger, a little stronger, be able to reach a little better. Once they're a little bit older, they'll start producing wax, carrying food, building comb, and have undertaker duties. And that's a very interesting video that you'll see later. Here, it's more of the stage of making things. They're making food, taking food, making comb, to store food in and to store the eggs in, and producing wax. When they get a little older, then they start to protect the hive entrance and do guard duty. And that's actually what the bees in this picture are doing here. So they're just staying really close to the entrance. And this is a hot day, so some of them are fanning, but others are just kind of standing there and keeping guard just in case anything happens by the entrance, they're ready to go. And then until the end of their life, they collect. They collect pollen, they collect nectar, they collect water, which they often use to cool down the hive, although they don't actually drink the water themselves. So they gather all these resources, and unfortunately, that is usually how the worker bees pass. They actually work themselves to death. So they usually pass away when they're in the field collecting pollen and nectar and water, and then they just don't make it back to the hive. And here I have some things to show us about some of those duties that they're doing. So these guys are performing something called an orientation flight. Although they've been alive for a few weeks, they've never actually left the hive, and they need to learn where it is. They have really good homing instincts, almost to a flaw. So they will forage in around a 4-mile radius of where their hive is, and they can almost always find their way back home. But their ability to find their home is so good that if you move their home 5 feet to the left, it confuses them beyond belief, and it makes it really difficult for them to find their way back into the hive. So this is the first time that these bees are leaving, so you'll see them coming in and around the entrance, just trying to orient themselves. Some of them are a little wobbly too. Maybe they need some more practice. And these guys are protecting the hive. So there's a couple different ways that they would protect the hive. They're going to protect it up here on the frames, which you'll see when you inspect them, and they'll also protect the hive entrance. And they have a lot of things to protect the hive from. There are a lot of predators of bees. Some of them might surprise you, like skunks. Skunks love to come up to the hive, take a big handful of bees, chew them all up, and spit them out. So to prevent that, we put some of the hives up so that way when they try to go in there and eat the bees can reach their bellies and sting them and scare them away. Mice could be a big problem when it's really cold over winter. The mice might try to move in there, and I've seen more than a few mice in hives. So when they move in there, generally the bees try to scare them out. They don't like the smell of the mice or the smell of the mouse waste. Also, everybody knows that bears are attracted to hives. Maybe not for the reason you would think. Winnie the Pooh has taught us that bears love honey, but actually, a lot of bears really love protein. So when they break into the hive, they're actually trying to steal and eat the larvae, which are a really good protein source. Unfortunately, when they do that, they end up tearing these places apart. So we do try to keep bears out. Often, a lot of people in our area in particular might have some electric fences if they've seen some bears around to keep the bears away. And that's also popular when you go west into to Loudon and out by Winchester. That's pretty common. When I open up the hive, I do use smoke to calm them down, but it doesn't always work all of the time, and they do still want to protect their hive. Always they want to protect it. So you'll see all their faces sticking out and just watching and waiting to see if I'm going to do something I'm not supposed to do so that they have a reason to sting me. So here are some of them who are protecting their hives. So some of them are walking around, but a lot of them have their heads facing forward, just watching me. They will have their eyes out so that they can see the danger coming, and they'll also buzz really loudly to warn the danger away. So I don't think that the videos I have today are sending across a lot of sound, but when I share this, I'll try to include sound with those. They do buzz very loudly when they're trying to warn away danger. They also sometimes need to protect the hive from each other. So in the summer, when there's not a lot flowering, water resources are low, it's really hot, some of the bees are not getting the resources that they need. So they might try and take them from someplace else. It's particularly easy to steal from another hive if you found a sneaky way in. So in this video, the white hive is actually my hive, and the bees that are trying to get in are from a hive that's on a different property. So I didn't know where they came from, but I came in one day and I saw them trying to get in up under the cover, which is that piece there. And so luckily my bees were very high on their defenses and they tried to stop them from coming in. So they were able to protect their resources. As they get a little older, they do protect and they also keep the hive cool. Bees can fly right at about 50, 55 degrees Fahrenheit. But once it gets too hot, once we get into those 90-degree days, it gets way too toasty for them inside the hive. The hives usually retain a lot of heat, which is good for keeping the brood warm, but not so good for the bees that are already overheated from all of their field work. So they bring in a lot of water and they also fan down the hive. And to do that, they stand in front of it like this with their abdomens raised and they start fanning. and it creates almost like a little filter, like a mini air conditioning unit that keeps the hive cool. And this is another very interesting job that the bees have. I actually recorded this one about 2 weeks ago. So I did mention that one of the jobs that a bee has is to be an undertaker. If for any reason a bee dies in the hive, they're very clean and they take them out right away. So in this video here, I got a video of these worker bees removing, or more accurately, trying to remove dead bees from the bottom of the hive. So they actually use their hind legs to carry them. And unfortunately, he couldn't get over the ledge. And neither of these were actually able to remove the bees while I was watching, but they were able to take them out the hive entrance a little bit later. They usually take dead bees, debris, anything in the hive that's not supposed to be there, and they'll throw it out the front of the hive entrance. So you'll often see a lot of debris right outside the hive entrance. They remove trash and debris. If I'm inspecting and a leaf gets in there or anything like that, they'll remove that. They'll remove bee waste. They'll remove any intruders that might get in that they kill while they're in the hive. And they'll also collect pollen. So I wish I had a really good video of these guys, but these pictures will be pretty good. The bee over on the left has his pollen baskets, or her pollen baskets full. And the pollen baskets are these little hairs that they have on their back legs that really sticky pollen sticks to. And they go to flower to flower to flower, collecting pollen onto those baskets. And when they're full, they bring them back into the hive, where other worker bees take them and pack them away into the cells. So that's one of the bees that is a forager bee, a field bee. And then over on the right, you'll see one of the worker bees who had helped one of the field bees and is still covered with a little bit of pollen from her help. These guys are collecting nectar. Now, I wasn't lucky enough to go find a bee collecting nectar from a flower, but on here, these two bees that look like they're giving each other a kiss almost are actually sharing nectar. So the bee that is on top is a field bee that has collected that nectar, and the bee that's towards the bottom is a worker bee inside. So that bee is going to take the nectar from the first bee and go put it into a cell to store it for later. So as I play this video, notice that the bee on the bottom, the worker bee from inside the hive, is going to have a very long proboscis. And that's basically her tongue that sticks out and is going to collect the nectar from the other bee. And the bee up top, we'll see her abdomen moving quite a lot. And she's actually using air to push out some of the nectar that she has to give to the other bee that lives inside the hive. And one of our favorite things that bees do is making honey. So right now they are taking these cells and they're building them up, and they're going to be storing nectar in them. Once they've stored the nectar in them and they cover them up, they ferment and they turn into honey. So this is what it looks like when they're working to build the cells to store the honey in. And in the background, that is my smoker running. It kept them very happy for this video. And then one of the last jobs they have is to build comb. They don't always build the comb exactly where you want them to. So this is from 2016 when I was at George Mason and we had some beehives, and their population just exploded. So they decided they needed more space. They needed more room for more larvae, more room for more food, more room for more nectar. And so they started building it on the roof, or on the lid of this box. and we didn't want them to keep it there, so we had to remove it. So these are a couple pictures, just the process of what they had started to build and what it looked like after we smoked the bees off and the process of removing it. I got another good question. What is the source of the wax? The bees themselves produce the wax. The bees are pretty amazing in that they produce almost everything they need or are able to collect it. So underneath their abdomen, they have something called a wax gland, actually several wax glands, and they secrete little panels of wax, little tiny pieces that they can chew up into the shape that they want and then patch them into place to fit the size of the cells or to cover up anything that they need to. Not only are they very good at finding where their home is, but they're very good at knowing exactly how big their home needs to be. So there's an idea called bee space, where if you leave them too much space, they'll start to build comb, like this. And if you don't give them enough space, they'll take propolis, which is another thing that they collect. It's basically tree sap, and they'll seal up all the nooks and crannies so that the air can't get in and predators can't get in and pests can't get in. And there's this very narrow window of size, approximately the size of a bee, that is perfect for them. So here we'd given them too much space for too long, and they took advantage of it. If anyone has any questions about bee jobs or anything else that bees make, go ahead and send me a chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll respond to it. Here, I'm going to talk a little bit about where honeybees live. Honeybees live in man-made spaces in places called apiaries. And an apiary is a designated location for a collection of beehives. We also call them more casually bee yards. If you have one beehive, it would not be in an apiary. Generally, when you talk about an apiary, you're talking about many different beehives that are all in a similar place. And remember that I told you that bees are very, very good at being homing devices. So even though these hives are only a few feet apart, they know exactly where their hive is. Every apiary or bee yard needs to have a couple of things. It needs to have easy access. You need to be able to reach that to take care of them. So you need to be able to get into the hives without crossing anything hazardous. So you can't have hoses there that you might trip over. You wouldn't want to have thorns or really, really tall wax where you might, any tall weeds where you might get ticks. So you want to make sure it's a safe place. You also need to have them protected from pests and from danger and not in the way of people. So in this picture, you'll see that the grass is cut low so that there's no chance of getting ticks or anything like that. The fence is there so that if anybody is walking by, they'll see the fence and they'll clearly see that they shouldn't be getting too close to those hives. The hives are also a little farther from the fence just so that anyone who's going by is not going to be too close to the hives. The hives also have, at the very left of the picture, there's a little blue square. That's actually a water dish. The bees need water again to cool down their hive and things like that, so it's important to give them water close by. If you don't, they'll go find it wherever it's near. So that might be your neighbor's swimming pool, which your neighbor tends not to like so much. So it's good to give them everything that they'll need right there. And if they don't like that home for whatever reason, they'll do this, swarming. I'm sure we've all seen a lot of these pictures. This is what you think when you think of wild honeybees. This is actually a picture that my aunt took of one that was in her yard about 40 feet up, which is why it's a little fuzzier. A swarm is also known as a wild hive, and bees could swarm for largely two reasons. One is that their home is no longer safe or it's not a good place for them to be anymore. So they will swarm, they'll fly together, they'll find a new location, and they often end up in places that we don't want them, like someone's attic or under someone's porch. So it's important that if you have bees and they're not in a good location or they're not in a safe place, to make sure that they are in a safe place. And then another ties back to that idea of a superorganism. We talked about how individual bees are born when they start as an egg and become a larva and then a pupa and now they're a bee. But that's just the individual. When you look at the big superorganism, they also reproduce. And the way they do that is if you have a hive that has a high enough population that some of them could leave and both of that groups would be okay, often a group does leave. So a group of workers that are already able to fly and able to leave the hive will take the queen that lives in the hive and go find a new place. That's likely what happened here in this picture. And when they find a new place, they find a bigger, better location, we hope, and they stay there. And back in the old hive, the workers that have stayed behind raise a new queen. And since they raised her from an egg, she's got pheromones that they're used to, and that hive becomes very strong. So often as a beekeeper, you have to split your hives. You have to do almost a artificial swarm to take the queen and some of the bees and put them elsewhere. Otherwise, they will swarm on you and you lose your bees, which no beekeeper likes very much. When they're on the move and they go places you don't want them to, you see things like this. So this was a great article that came out last year on WAMU. And in Annandale, there were a swarm of bees who decided the best home for them would be inside this car. Now, we recommend that they don't stay inside the car, but it probably was protected. It would have kept them safe from the rain for now. And I'm glad that someone stepped in, another beekeeper showed up and helped out this situation, but they might have moved on. You just never know. So you want to make sure that if there's a swarm out there and they're very vulnerable, that you can protect them. So a lot of beekeepers will go take them and put them onto their bee yards. So this is what it looks like when your hive plans to swarm. They're doing what they're supposed to do. So they build special cells to hold their queen. You've seen in all these pictures, the queen is really long and she has this really long abdomen. And so she can't stay in the regular cells that the workers and the drones stay in. So they build these devices called queen cups, there's two of them there on the left picture and one here on the right picture. And they raise the queen there. So the queen cups are much bigger than the usual cells because the queen is so much bigger. And what's interesting about these queen cups is they will move them based on why they're swarming and why they're splitting. So if they are going to swarm and they've planned it out, they actually put these cups along the bottom of the frame so they actually have more room. And if they have to have a new queen because something happened to their old queen, they just have to build a cup wherever they have an egg. So these ones here are not on the bottom because something happened to the queen in this hive and they had to replace her very quickly. So they built these a little bit haphazardly. And if it's ready for a traditional swarm, you'll see them all lined up along the bottom panels. So when you're inspecting the hive, here's all those pictures I was talking about where you hold it up to the light. It does make a great picture, but they are looking for the eggs in there. So these pictures, unfortunately, none of these are mine except for the one in the center, which was from the beekeeping class I took at George Mason. There are a lot of common factors between these images, though. Firstly, safety gear. And I know we're hearing a lot about PPE recently, so you'll hear about it some more now. All of these guys have safety gear. And again, if you ask 10 beekeepers a question, you'll get 11 answers. And if you ask a beekeeper, what's the appropriate amount of PPE or safety gear, you'll get a lot of different answers. It really all depends with your level of comfort. So I think in all these, they have full body suits. There are some suits that are just like sweatshirts that you wear. They all have this veil to protect their face and their neck. You don't want to get stung in the face and the neck. All of them have gloves, and they're wearing the gloves to protect their hands. You don't want to get stung, especially on your finger, and then you have to work a lot more on your hives. That could hurt quite a bit. Personally, I wear the veil and I wear a sweatshirt style white covering to protect myself. I also wear jeans, which are pretty thick material, so I'm not worried about the bees getting through there. And I choose not to work with gloves. And the reason that I personally choose not to work with gloves is because I find that when the gloves are really large, it makes it difficult for me to feel the frames and feel the bees. And the easiest way to get stung is to accidentally squish a bee. So if I can feel better and if I can touch and tell there's a bee there and not squish them, I'm much less likely to be stung. And I've been beekeeping for 5 years and I've been stung 4 times. So I think I'm doing pretty good out of the hundreds of thousands of bees that would have had the chance to sting me, but wouldn't because I'm a very nice beekeeper. They all have open space. All these pictures have plenty of space for everyone to work. That bottom picture has a little bit of high grass, but at least there's no other obstacles in the way. And they all have good weather. You can only do this in good weather. Bees do not like being rained on. They all have a close eye to see small changes and small bugs. You can tell they're all being careful. And they also all have help. Even if there's not 2 beekeepers in this picture, somebody's taking that photo. So they do have someone there for help. So this is one of those hobbies that if you're interested in it, it's always nice to have a friend who can help you or anyone else who might be interested in inspecting the hive with you. So that's a little bit on my background about honeybees. And then we get to talk a little bit about why they are so important in agriculture. So if you have any questions about anything that you've already seen about the hive, go ahead and send those in the chat or you can raise your hand and I'll go ahead and talk to you about those because I know that seeing bees arises a lot of really good questions. So we get to talk a little bit about pollination services in agriculture. Honeybees add at least $15 billion to the value of U.S. agriculture annually. And in fact, in recent years, it's actually been much higher, closer to 18 billion. There are 2.7 million colonies in the United States today, and about 2/3 of those are used for pollination services. These are some of those agricultural foods that are pollinated by bees. We have melons, apples, cranberries, broccoli, blueberries, and cherries are actually 90% reliant on honeybee pollination. So without honeybees, we are very unlikely to have blueberries and cherries in our markets. And then, of course, almonds. So these almonds are actually 100% reliant on honeybee pollination. Without honeybees, there will be no almonds. 1.8 million honeybee colonies are used each year to pollinate 1 million acres of almond orchards. I think that this is very important, especially for people like me. I'm actually lactose intolerant, so I can't have regular milk, and I love almond milk, and I would be so disappointed if I couldn't have almond milk anymore. I got a really good question. Do your bees recognize you and do they act differently towards other people? Sometimes I like to think they recognize me, but I don't think so. I think if anything, they recognize my smell and the process of doing an inspection. I do it the same way every time. I go over to the hive, I've got all my gear on, I open it up, I take the smoker, I go and I put a little bit of smoke on them, and then I start taking out the frames, and I always start right to left. Why that direction, I don't know, but I always do, and I check each one, and then I put them all back, and then I close it up. I think they are also used to my smell. When my partner goes out with me, we both use the same laundry detergent, so we both smell pretty similar. So I've noticed that they act very nice around him. I have had someone with very strong perfume come out to the hives. The bees did not like that very much. So I don't think that they recognize me, but rather they recognize the process, and they're very susceptible to different smells because the smells can actually interrupt the queen pheromones. So if you do have those really strong smells in there, that could upset them. So it's great to talk about these almond orchards that are out in California, but it's really hard to think about what we're doing here that bees can lend themselves to. Locally, we have a lot of farms in Northern Virginia that can benefit from having honeybees nearby. So while we don't have acres and acres and acres of almonds, we do still have a lot of spaces that need to be pollinated, and especially foods like these. We have a lot of small farms that grow pumpkins and strawberries. And in the fall, you can go to these farms and pick the pumpkins, and in the spring and summer, you can go pick the strawberries. So that's also good for tourism, getting people to visit. Northern Virginia is also known for our many wineries and vineyards, and those vineyards also need pollinating as well. There are a lot of gardens that we might have in our backyard that need to be pollinated, small local farms. And if you join us this year for our virtual sustainable garden tour, you'll actually see a lot of these homeowners are very happy to have pollinators like honeybees in their local gardens doing some pollination work. So just to look at what bees are truly doing here, bees forage in a 4-mile radius. So my beehives are actually not located in Fairfax County. Mine are located in Loudoun County out in Hamilton. So the little white dot at the center of the circle is where my beehives are. And then my intern, Tessa, helped me to draw a circle around here that's 4 miles in radius to see where the bees might forage and who they might be helping. And you can see there's quite a few farms on here. And the bees that live in my apiary are likely to help pollinate corn, strawberries, pumpkins, grapes, squash, zucchini, onions, tomatoes, and alfalfa. Corn is actually a really big job because each of the little kernels of corn, each one of those needs to be pollinated individually, which is a lot of work. So having a lot of pollinators is really going to help you get that done. So these guys here are also in a really big wine area. If you've ever been out by Purcellville or Hamilton, you'll actually see on this map there's quite a few vineyards. And so they also do very well with pollination, and they appreciate beekeepers like myself being nearby. We'll look at some other local bees. If you have not been to visit the George Mason University apiary, I highly recommend you at least go drive by and see what it's like when it's an appropriate time for us to be visiting things like that. They usually have 15 or so hives. The Honeybee Initiative, who put the hives there, have also put bees at the I-66 transfer station. They have a plot there, and a couple other locations as well, some further west. But those bees that are there at George Mason University, we think George Mason is so close to downtown Fairfax, there's nothing there they can be doing. But they actually help to pollinate a lot of vegetable gardens. George Mason has some vegetable gardens that they use for some really great purposes, both to teach their students and to provide food for their students. Landscaping flowers, pollinator gardens, and then a lot of personal vegetable gardens, which we wouldn't be able to identify on this map. And then I thought of something silly, which is that our office is in the Harrity building, which is across the street from the Government Center in Fairfax. So what if we put beehives on the roof of the Government Center in Fairfax? Currently, a lot of roof space isn't being used. So I wonder if we put them there, what they would do for agriculture. And it turns out quite a lot. They do overlap a bit with the George Mason University beehives, but it's also a great opportunity to reach some of those farms that we have down a little bit to the south and provide all those vegetables as well. So here is, I believe, my last video, and I just wanted you to see some of those cool behaviors we didn't get to see in some other videos, particularly the waggle dance. Everybody loves the waggle dance. You can see some of those bees shaking it, and they are directing some of the other bees about where to go. So some of them are guarding, some of them are talking to each other and sending messages through waggling or through pheromones and smell. They're a very, very interesting thing to just watch for a while, just to see what they do. I know we're getting a little close to the end of our time, so I just want to share something that's pretty important, which is that honeybees are at risk. In 2015, 42% of all of the beehives in the United States died. And actually, in 2015, I lost both of my hives as well. It was a pretty bad year. Although we're dropping, honeybee colonies used to be about 5 million in the 1940s. We've recently gained a couple 100,000 in the past couple years. So although honeybees are not where they were, they're doing pretty well in comparison to a couple of years ago. I hope to see this upward trend continue. And I could not possibly talk about honeybees without also talking about our native bees. There are over 400 native bee species in Virginia alone, and they all matter so much for pollinating native plants. They evolved alongside these native plants so that they bloom when the pollinators are searching for food. They have the right length of proboscis or tongue to reach into the flower to get the nectar. These native pollinators are so important. And I want to say that I know awareness is very high for honeybees, but I tend to look at them as a species that helps you think of other species. When I say pollinator, you think of a honeybee. Just like if I say a zoo animal, you think of a lion or a tiger or a panda. And just because you didn't think of an aardvark doesn't mean that you don't want to protect the aardvark. So in this case, I'm using honeybees as a way to talk about how important pollination is for agriculture and for all of our other plants, and open up that door to talk about native bees as well. These bees are very good for native plants. Honeybees are very good for agriculture, certainly have their place, but they're not the only pollinator invited to the table. If you enjoyed learning about pollinators and are a student or know a student who would like to join in our art contest, we are having students design posters on the theme of where would we be without pollinators, and the deadline is August 14th. And I'll try and provide a link to that as well. We do have some more information on our website, and Scouts can get a patch for that. So I'm going to skip through this next bit real quick. Oh, if you are interested in learning more about beekeeping in Northern Virginia and how you can get involved, there are a lot of local associations and they all have Facebook pages. I think that's a great place to start. And I'll have this available, this video will be available, so you can go ahead and look into those organizations. And then here's my last video. Just want to see the queen travel around a little bit. And at this point, I'll take any questions that you might have before we wrap up for today. I got a question about if I've ever thought about doing a live demo of an inspection. That's actually something that I've thought about because a lot of people ask a lot of questions about bees. If you say that you're a beekeeper, people have a lot of questions, and I'd be very happy to answer those. It is a little harder to schedule because it has to be a sunny day, it has to be of a certain temperature, and they have to be of a certain attitude. But if others would be interested in seeing a live inspection demo, make a comment. I think we'll give that a try. I got a question, what kind of bees live underground? That is a very good question. Let me go back to my native bee slide. So I'm not sure which of these native pollinators live underground. I believe there are several of them that live in leaf litter, and they stay there over winter. That's actually one of the reasons why it's recommended that when you mow your lawn, just to leave the grass lie, leave the leaves lie, just let it all stay because something is going to use that as habitat. So I wish I knew how to better answer your question, but I'll actually go back to the page where it's got my contact info. And if I haven't been able to answer your question today, just go ahead and shoot me an email and I'll research it and I'll get back to you. Oh, I got another question. What is the most surprising thing that you have learned about bees? That's a really good question. I have learned a lot of really interesting things about bees, but I think that the most interesting thing that I learned about bees is the whole idea of the pheromones and that they can talk to each other without ever using words. Now, I said the most likely way to get stung is to squish a bee, and when the bees are squished, they release a pheromone that says, help me. And so other bees will go and try to help them, and unfortunately to sting me, which I don't like very much. But it's fascinating that these things that we see as insects actually have very advanced ways of communicating with each other. I just want to see, does anybody else have any other questions? If you'd also prefer to ask it out loud, you can also raise your hand and I can click on your icon to unmute your mic if you like. If you do have any other questions, you can reach me. My email is ashley.palmer@fairfaxcounty.gov. You can also call me at 703-324-1423. I am currently out of the office, but when I get back, I'll be sure to check all of my messages. I think that's all I've got for today. Thank you guys so much for joining us for our very first webinar. I hope that you liked it, and we look forward to seeing you on Thursday when we do our We All Live in a Watershed presentation, and every Thursday at 3 for more kinds of soil and water knowledge and fun facts. Alrighty, guys. Have a great day.